Informal fresh produce markets provide a source of affordable food for more than 80% of the population in developing countries and opportunity to generate income for small-scale farmers. With a rising population and increasing demand, there is an even greater need to improve food safety in wet markets in Kenya that has been heightened by the coronavirus pandemic. This 25th of November, Micro Enterprises Support Program Trust, in partnership with the Ministry of Health, AgriFI, DANIDA, and the European Union, will explore the importance of food safety in our markets, emerging and re-emerging food safety concerns, legal and regulatory framework and infrastructure, and capacity intervention in response to the coronavirus pandemic.
Hello and welcome, wherever you're joining us, to this special edition of Farm Kenya Special. I am Dr. Mercy Korir. With over half of the world's population now living in urban areas, food markets have become important sources of affordable food for millions of people. At the same time, however, such markets have been associated with major outbreaks of diseases, including cholera, SARS, and the coronavirus, which the world is currently battling. Food markets in Kenya vary greatly from county to county, depending on the local culture, socio-economic conditions, food varieties, and dietary preferences. All food markets, however, should have one major thing in common. They should provide the community with safe and nutritious food. This forms the basis of our discussion on food safety in wet markets. And joining me to shine a spotlight on the importance of food safety in wet markets is a rich panel of experts. First is Mr. Henning Hoy Nigard, who is the Sector Councillor for Food and Agriculture in the Royal Danish Embassy. He holds a Master's in International Economy and Geography. Mr. Henning is formerly the head of Business Development, Danish SME Federation. He is a public-private partnership specialist, food and agriculture. Second is Brenda Sikolo, who is joining us in Nairobi. Brenda is the head of the Division of Food Safety at the Ministry of Health, Food Safety Unit. Brenda holds a Master's of Science in Health Management from the Kenyatta University. She's also the lead instructor in food safety and coordinates multi-sectoral collaboration programs. Joining us also in studio is Dr. Charles Ochodo, who is the Senior Deputy Director of Veterinary Services, the Head of Veterinary Governance and Policy at the Directorate of Veterinary Services in the Ministry of Agriculture, Livestock and Fisheries. He holds a PhD in Environmental Science from Egerton University. Dr. Ochodo is also a member of the Kenya Veterinary Board. Last but not least is Josephine Natecho Simiyu, who is the Manager, Interim Regulations and Compliance at AFA. She holds a Master of Science in International Horticulture from the University of Essex. Josephine has over 15 years of experience in the horticulture sector with an expertise in food safety, traceability, policy and regulatory affairs. You can also be part of this conversation by engaging us on social media. Our social media handles are the hashtag FarmKenya, at KTN News KE, at Dr. Mercy Korir, at FarmKenya254 on Twitter, and also you can join us on slido.com. The event code is the hashtag FarmKenya. We are also live on our sister station, KTN Farmers TV. Let's now start this conversation. And I would want to have to start this conversation with Brenda, just to explain to us what wet markets are. I know we've been talking about markets, wet markets, they're dry markets. When you're talking about wet markets and the concern that we have on food safety, what exactly are we talking about, Brenda?
Thank you, Mercy, and thank you for also hosting me on your station. I'll go straight to the question. When you talk about wet markets, or if I to give a very typical example, is a place like Marigiti. You'll also be talking of a place like Sokomjinga in Nyandarua. You'll also be talking of, there are quite a number of them, even this Dagoretti market where we find our meat. Yeah, those are the typical markets. And again, also Githurai, there's that market, and then also the Kangemi market.
What is it about
So those
these
are the
markets
that we are
make
talking
them
about.
wet markets, Brenda? What is it about
And
the
this
markets?
Pardon?
So, what is it that makes the markets that you've talked about wet markets? What is the special characteristics of these markets that is a matter of concern?
One, they normally sell the perishables. We are talking of the vegetables, we are talking of meat, we are talking of fish. Yeah, the perishables, products that are supposed to be consumed in the shortest time.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah,
let me just move to Mr. Henning and ask you about your concern about this issue of wet markets. We know the current pandemic which the world is battling is as a result of, mixing of live animals in a market, and, that this virus jumped and it has affected us as humans. Why is it a matter of concern?
Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity for me to be a part of this talk show today about food safety. We have worked with food safety for the last 4 years at the Royal Danish Embassy in a program with DANIDA and involving our Danish Veterinary and Food Administration in a program we called the Strategic Sector Collaboration Program. And 2 years ago, EU asked us to bring on board component 2 and 3 in a bigger program called AgriFI that also work at the county level. And when we started this activity and working together, we could see that there was major challenges at the wet markets in Kenya. And I think it was mainly when the COVID-19 outbreak came that we decided to restructure some of our activities in the AgriFi program together with MESPT to cope with these challenges. They have the wet markets and the challenges here with the mix of live animals, fresh fruit, fresh meat, fish and all that has been on the agenda all the time. There is hygienic problems, there is problem with clean water, there's a problem with the regulation and the control of the food. And we have discussed that with our good partners among the authorities for quite a long time. I think that the major push for us to suggest much more focus on the wet market, it came along with the COVID-19 crisis. So it was actually not a new area of concern for us. We have also raised it with the counties when we discuss food safety policies at county level. And I think the main focus for us in the beginning was actually how the wet markets were regulated, because regulation of food safety in Kenya has to be moved from end product to food business operators. And when a marketplace is owned and regulated by the counties, it can be really, really difficult to regulate and control own operations. So here, main challenges started, and this is what we now have decided to really push forward with much more resources.
Mm-hmm. And we'll come back to really dissect the issue of regulation. But before we do that, let's hear from Dr. Ochodo. From a veterinary perspective, Brenda has mentioned one of the markets being at Dagoretti, which is really popular as an abattoir. And here, animals come in live before, they are slaughtered and they are sold to customers and consumers. What is the concern from a veterinary perspective?
Thank you, Dr. Mercy, and thank you for inviting me to your studios. I would like to give a small definition of wet markets, just in addition to what Brenda had said. And wet markets are called wet because normally what is traded there is fresh produce, and this may be vegetables, fruits, fish, meat, and things like milk. And what makes these markets wet is that most of what is sold here, like the vegetables, are kept fresh by a bit of water being sprinkled there. And things like meat and fish drip blood and other fluids. And there is also a lot of cleaning using water. So that makes the whole place wet, literally. And in our setting in the country, most of these markets are really in the open. So if you look at Kangemi market, for example, Wakulima market that is even overflowing into the street, Kongowea market down at the coast, most of these markets are really at the open, in the open, and therefore we have rain getting in, and this of course increases the wetness. And this is as opposed to the dry markets that would sell merchandise like clothes and shoes, for example. Now coming to the veterinary connection in the wet markets, and you've given the example of Dagoretti Abattoir. That is a place where cattle, sheep, and goats are slaughtered, and then the meat is prepared and actually sold in those slaughterhouses, and then transported to butcheries. So the challenges we have there are that we have live animals in the slaughter facilities, and sometimes it's possible to have contact either directly between these animals and the meat. When the animals, for example, move into some of the places where the meat is being processed, things like matumbo, for example, sometimes it's washed in the open, and you'll see a few animals crossing in there. We also have a huge number of personnel working in those establishments, and sometimes there is no controlled movement between what we call the dirty areas and the clean areas, where the dirty areas are the places where the animals are and where the flaying takes place, and the clean areas are the places where we have the carcass. So what is possible is that contamination can happen between the live animals and the meat that is now food in the form of excretions from these animals, either from the nostrils, from the mouth, or even urine, or even the fecal content, which, as we know, are sources of microorganisms like E. coli and Salmonella, many microorganisms you may think of. Animals also carry diseases like brucellosis. The personnel also are another source of infection, because with poor sanitation, then problems like cholera, typhoid, and so on can happen. And the vermin, these rodents that might be in the place, things like rats, can also transfer diseases from the surrounding homes into these places, and you have problems like plague occurring in some of these places. We have not had that in the country recently. But what is also important about wet markets is that in recent times there have been the sources of some of what we are calling emerging diseases. In 2007, or 2004, sorry, we had some of the first outbreaks of the avian influenza, and this was associated with birds, chicken in the wet markets. Then in the year 2002, we had the severe acute respiratory syndrome, also associated with some of the wet markets. Then in 2009, we had swine flu, another emerging disease that was associated with pigs and pork in the wet markets. Then in 2012, we had MESPT, the Middle East respiratory syndrome. This is not really associated with the wet markets in the way we know them, but is associated with camels. But remember, camels are also sold in livestock markets, which in a way may also qualify as wet markets because of the excretions that may come from the animals. And what is now topical is COVID-19. And the viewers know this disease is suspected to have come out of a wet market in Hunan province, Wuhan city, to the seafood market in China. So wet markets are really a problem in terms of disease. But wet markets are not just a problem. They are also very important in the economies of countries, and particularly the developing countries like Kenya, because these so-called wet markets are the key outlets for most of the agricultural produce, the vegetables, the fruits, even the livestock in terms of meat, the fish, and so on. The fish landing sites, remember, another form of wet markets, and that's where it's sold. And so they stimulate agricultural growth, particularly among the small-scale farmers. They are also key in food security and nutrition of people, particularly in the urban areas. Most of us really get our food from these so-called wet markets. Just a few of us are able to get to the supermarkets and to eateries where we pick food that is ready, and so on. So these wet markets are really important establishments that government really needs to take into consideration.
Okay, I want to bring in Josephine on just the point that you're talking about, the importance of wet markets. And there's a concern that when talking about wet markets, there's more of heavy look at levies that are imposed, or some of the charges that are imposed for people to access the market, as opposed to what kind of markets are there and the quality of produce and even the safety or the cleanliness of the place, like Daktari has explained. Is this what has been happening even before COVID?
Thank you, Mercy. And indeed, what you have highlighted is actually true. I'd like, first of all, to just show the magnitude of movement of horticultural produce in wet markets. We produce close to 6 million tons of fruits and vegetables annually. And out of this, 94% is consumed domestically. And out of this also, 90% finds its way in the wet markets where majority of us buy produce. So in terms of the assessment of quality at the wet markets, really that has been a challenge. And it's because of the issue of enforcement at the county level, where it's not, really the roles are not separated in terms of the quality checks, the levy checks, but of course the establishment of a wet market provides really an opportunity where competent authorities together with the county governments then can agree and come up with modalities of enforcing food safety at the wet markets. Because if you look at the supply side, if not well regulated in terms of the transport that brings in the fresh vegetables and fruits into the market. Also the hygiene issues by the personnel who are handling the products, the areas where these products are being displayed at the market. Really, these are the risk areas which can be teased out to put in controls in order to ensure that we have safe food that is provided at the market. So really, the issue of levies is actually the mandate of counties to charge levies. However, then it should also be commensurate to the services that are also provided at the market in terms of also the sanitation, but also in terms of what regulators have done, particularly AFA, is that we've developed a code of practice which also highlights the responsibility of the food business operators at the market to take greater responsibility in terms of ensuring food safety at the market. So then the wet markets provides an oversight opportunity for the regulators to come in and just validate that these food business operators are doing the right thing, including the counties as well, who are able to use the codes of practice to be able to ensure that fruits and vegetables are safe in the market. Mercy. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Josephine. I would like to go to Mr. Henning. Now, these markets clearly are an important source of food, and at the same time, they pose a risk, like Dr. Ochoda has explained, in terms of spreading some of these pathogens. How do we strike a balance, knowing that we still need these markets and we are well aware of the emerging and re-emerging issues that the market, or risks that the market pose to us? How do we strike that balance?
That's a very good question. Thank you for that. I'm very sure that the wet markets will be here for quite a long time. But I think there's a lot Kenya can do. I think I have quite some echo, so I can only hear myself. But Josephine, she was talking about the different mandates that are regulating and taking care of food safety at the wet markets, and I think it's the same at the wet market level as it is for the rest of Kenya. That a better and well organized and structured cooperation between the 10 competent authorities that regulate this area can certainly be improved together with the county level. And I think that's also an area, a subject for intervention that we are imposing on. Right now, with the new wet market approach in the AgriFI program and the SSC program we are running, we try to take out a number of pilot counties, Nyandarua, Nakuru, and today I heard Kilifi is also among the pilot counties where we will try and make a good model and a very good cooperation between the central competent authorities and the county authorities in regulating and having discussions how the improvements can take place. The wet markets will be here, but it's, to my point of view, it's a question of how we regulate and do inspection at the local market. Of course, there's a lot of physical infrastructure and investment that can be done, but investments in hygiene, access to clean water and toilets and so on is of course not enough, and it has to go hand in hand with a regulatory approach that we talked about before. But I'm very happy for Mr. Ochodo's presentation about all the threat we see at the wet market level. It summarized very well the challenges that Kenya have in this area. And we have also in our program to coordinate food safety regulation in our multi-annual national control plan with all the competent authorities. We also bringing in Nairobi County. And I know they are quite far in changing procedures and how to do inspection at the wet market level. I think today many operators, small vendors at the wet markets, they are used to be very passive and wait for the authorities to tell them what to do, even they have maybe no resources. Instead, that procedure has to be changed. They need to know their own risk. They need to know how they can improve the situation and then present it to the authorities, to the control and to the inspectors at the wet market level. And if it is, they don't know how to clean their hands, how to cut the meat in a hygienic way, I will recommend that we close some of these operations. It is a serious threat to health in Kenya, and I think the rest of the region and is also looking at Kenya, and in some cases Kenya cannot even export to neighboring countries because of the handling of food. So I think there's a lot of things we can do without huge investments.
Okay. Brenda, coming back to you just before we go on break. The panelists have explained the challenges that are there in, handling the wet markets. You sit at the Ministry of Health. What are the challenges in overcoming these challenges? What are the bottlenecks that make it not possible to, streamline things and lessen the risks to the public?
Okay, first and foremost, maybe we may need to appreciate the kind of the data that is there on the illnesses that we get due to foodborne illnesses. Well, 1 in 10 people fall ill because of eating contaminated food. So we can talk of about 420,000. We get 420,000 deaths every year because of foodborne illnesses, and most of the people who are affected are children under 5. So we get, we normally record that deaths of about 125,000, and this is statistics that has been documented from WHO. Now, maybe the main challenge that we are facing, maybe from the ministry point of view, remember now we are a devolved country, so at the ministry level, national government, we concentrate more on policy development, capacity building, and then of course disseminating this information to our county colleagues. And now I'm narrowing down basically to the public health officers who are mandated to be carrying out issues about food safety, both at the national, that's at our points of entry, and then also at the county level, we have the public health officers who are also mandated using the Public Health Act, CAP 254, and we also have the Public Health Act, CAP 242, and the Food, Drugs and Chemical Substances Act, CAP 254. Now, what is happening is most of our counties have also come up with their own bylaws, of course coming from the national government, and getting the information from the national government, and they interpret them depending with how their county, they decide on how they want to enforce the laws that they put in. So it becomes a challenge in the sense that at times what has been prescribed is not what is implemented at that particular point. And then, of course, you can't be a regulator and at the same time, you're the same person who is also supposed to be doing the work. Let me give a practical example. I take a market like Marigiti. You find it's a public health officer who is in charge of that market. So ideally, he's supposed to be taking care of the cleaning aspect and again, regulating. You can't be the regulator and then you're also regulating yourself. I hope you are getting that. So if we are to address such a challenge, we may need to have a partnership, the public-private kind of a partnership, and then maybe the markets are given to the private sector, and then the government, the local government can come in and do the regulations. Otherwise, you cannot police yourself when you're at that point. So that is a major challenge that if maybe we are able to address, we'll be able to maybe move a step higher when it comes to managing our wet markets. I know we have quite a number of projects that have already been started in the country, and the most visible one is in Nyandarua and Nakuru, where we have MESPT have tried to improve the wet markets there. And of course, they are working also with us in the national government to come up with policies that will allow these markets, since they're the pilot, to really allow the private sector to run the markets. And then, of course, the revenue is being collected again by maybe the county government. And on the other hand, the public health officers regulate. If that model works, then we shall be able to address quite a number of issues that are touching these wet markets, which includes, of course, not just about the structures alone. We are talking about also sanitation. We are also talking about waste management, among other things. Thank you, Mercy. Back to you.
Okay, thank you, Brenda. And we'll come back on the second part of this conversation to look at what specific regulatory frameworks and legal frameworks that you are looking for, that you are recommending. Please continue having this conversation with us, Farm Kenya Special, where we are discussing wet markets in relations to food safety. With us on the panel to have this conversation is Mr. Henning Hoy, who is the Sector Councillor, Food and Agriculture at the Royal Danish Embassy. Brenda Obura joining us in Nairobi, who is the lead instructor at the Ministry of Health Food Safety Unit. Dr. Charles Ochodo, who is the Senior Deputy Director, Veterinary Services and Head of Veterinary Governance and Policy at the Directorate of Veterinary Services. And last but not least is Josephine Natecho Simiyu, who is the Manager, Interim Regulations and Compliance at the Agriculture and Food Authority, Horticulture Crops Directorate. Please have this conversation with us on our social media panels. You can tweet us at KTN News KE, at Dr. Mercy Korir, at Farm Kenya 254. You can also join us on slido.com. The event code is the hashtag Farm Kenya, and you can also just continue having this conversation with us. We will sample some of your feedback and some of your questions at the second part of this live broadcast. I'm Dr. Mercy Korir. Please stay with us.
Informal fresh produce markets provide a source of affordable food for more than 80% of the population in developing countries and opportunity to generate income for small-scale farmers. With a rising population and increasing demand, there is an even greater need to improve food safety in wet markets in Kenya that has been heightened by the coronavirus pandemic. This 25th of November, Micro Enterprises Support Programme Trust, in partnership with the Ministry of Health, AgriFI, DANIDA, and the European Union, will explore the importance of food safety in our markets, emerging and re-emerging food safety concerns, legal and regulatory framework and infrastructure, and capacity intervention in response to the coronavirus pandemic.
Good evening and thank you for joining us and keeping this conversation going on wet markets and food security. I am Dr. Mercy Korir, and joining me for this conversation is Mr. Henning Hoy from the Danish Embassy, Brenda Obura from the Ministry of Health, Dr. Charles Ochodo, who's from the Directorate of Veterinary Services, and Josephine Natecho from the Agriculture and Food Authority. And before we went on break, we were just touching on issues of legal and the regulatory framework on the wet markets. And I'd like to start with Dr. Ochodo. What are these legal, the specific legal loopholes or the legal gaps that are there that you would want or you would like see fixed so that our wet markets are safe?
Thank you, Dr. The legal framework for the wet markets is rather complicated in our country. And what makes the situation complicated is that we have many players, we have many institutions that have one or two mandates to regulate these markets. We have the Ministry of Health, for example. With its set of laws, the Public Health Act, the Food and Drugs Chemical Substances Act. We have the Directorate of Veterinary Services with the Meat Control Act, the Animal Diseases Act. We have KEBS, the Kenya Bureau of Standards, with the Standards Act. We have KEFIS with their act. We have AFA with their act. We have the Pest Control and Produce Board. We have the Kenya Fisheries Service with the Fishery Development and Management Act. We have other players, including the Ministry of Agriculture itself, NEMA, with the environment issues. And what then becomes a problem is who will do what and at what time. We have a whole host of inspectors getting to these wet markets to try and put things right. And so one of the challenges that arises is that there is duplication of effort and a bit of confusion among the operators in the market because today this person goes and says this, the next day somebody else says something else. And what we also see is sometimes this multiplicity of players also generates a situation where the next regulator thinks the other person is doing the work and nothing is really happening. So that sort of paralysis, thinking things are happening. And again, what makes the matter even a little bit more complicated is that some of the markets are directly controlled by the regulators. Brenda earlier mentioned the public health personnel being in charge. And so it becomes a little bit difficult for another regulator to go and point out issues where another regulator is already in place. So as a country, what we are doing about that, and we are working with the Danish government. Mr. Henning earlier mentioned this. We are working under a project we call the Strategic Sector Cooperation Project, and this started in 2016. What we are trying to do is to develop a control plan, a food control plan, that integrates the 10 to 11 regulators. And we call this plan the Multi-Annual National Control Plan because we review it every year. And under this plan, then we try to define our boundaries according to our mandates as spelled out in our laws. And we see where the gaps are, and then we see how we can address those gaps. Also, using this plan, we try to establish where we can have some sort of synergy so that we don't then need to inspect and reinspect. and places where there are overlaps, we see who can do that, and therefore we have some sort of agreement among ourselves on who is to do what. We have also developed certain principles of inspection, and these principles are the ones we now wish to apply as a team when dealing with these markets. And one of the principles is that the wet markets are businesses, and the operators there are food business operators. And therefore, we expect them to comply with the regulations. And these regulations are across the 10 institutions. Number two, we are stressing on a preventive approach, where we want to prevent problems, the ones we mentioned, before they happen. And also, when there is need for sanctions, we are not going for the very punitive sanctions. We are trying to see if we can correct things just by warnings and guiding, because most of what is happening there is also happening because of ignorance. It's only in extreme cases where we get to close some of these markets, for example, the slaughterhouses. If the hygiene situation becomes too bad, then we have to close. So that's one approach under the multi-annual national control plan, which is a quality assurance system for official control of food and animal health, plant health, and animal welfare. The second approach, and which we think will be a more permanent approach, is that we are developing a law, and this law we call the Food Safety Law. It is in the pipeline. Initially, it was combining drugs and the food. So we had Food and Drug Authority Bill. But we realized combining those two big issues was going to be a problem. And so we separated. And now we are developing this law, the 10 institutions involved in the wet markets. And the lead players are the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Agriculture. And the purpose of this law is to create a good coordination mechanism for the players in the wet market scene. And we believe when this law is in place and it's operational, then the authority that we wish to establish in the law will be able to follow up each regulator and find out what they are doing and ensure things are done, not policing as such, but just monitoring and reminding people to do what they are supposed to do. And where there are gaps, because there are gaps, certain forms of wet markets, you find them everywhere. There is even no inspection going on. This law, again, is expected to ensure all of the wet markets come under the view of the regulators. Sometimes we also forget that for wet markets to run properly, it's not basically a matter of the food safety laws, the ones I've referred to. It's also a question of planning. And the reason planning comes here is because these markets are found in highly populated places. And what is happening is that the towns and cities where these markets are established a while back, and these markets were appropriate for the towns then. But as the population has continued to grow and we have buildings and all manner of things happening around these markets, they have been squeezed off and there is no space for them to expand. And so you see Marigiti, people are now selling their wares on the road. Kangemi, people are literally on the road. And this is the nature of this market. So Planning is another area that may be a gap, and this is squarely now in the county governments. They need to have development plans running into several years, expecting what to do when this population grows and this market has to be here.
So there's a lot that is required there. I want to just bring in Josephine on that point, that you've mentioned so many different players that are needed here, straight from that vendor who is by the roadside all the way to, county governments and from the national government perspective. So I just want to ask Josephine, this looks like it's a Herculean task. Is it, to bring all these players together to make sure that our markets are safe eventually, such that the foods that we get at our tables are safe?
Dr. Mercy, I'd like just to mention that really what you have raised is a pertinent issue. Given the multiplicity of institutions involved in regulating the food safety, and Dr. Chodo has actually elaborated on that. In terms of it being a Herculean task, I'd look at it in what we are doing currently, because really that was the issue, bringing together all these institutions into a single unit that is actually really coordinated and synchronized in terms of delivering food safety issue. So within the multi-annual national control plan, actually it has been possible to develop one national plan that really caters for all the different roles of the different regulators in the horticulture value chain and even the meat sector where Dr. Chodo is. For example, really we know it is clear when it comes to matters of pesticides and registering pest control products, it's now clear on really a responsibility of PCPB. And then in terms of monitoring pesticide residue, then it's clearly the mandate of Kenya Plant Health Inspectorate Service. So then AFA really comes in with the setting in the rules along the value chain from production, transport, storage, up to when it reaches the wet market to ensure that there's a guarantee of products that are safe. So through the efforts of the Danish government, we've been able to be brought together on a single table to be able to develop a strategy on how to counter that. And I can just also mention that we've also had interventions in Nyandarua County, where we have closely worked with the county governments and a cooperative in Nyandarua to ensure that each aspect of food safety is covered by the different agencies that are regulating the horticulture value chain. So it also included also the private sector actors, because really the responsibilities of ensuring and ensuring that food is compliant to food safety is the onus is on them. So we have worked closely with these institutions to be able to do this. But of course it requires concerted efforts, and then also going back to our mandates and look where there are overlaps and try to reduce on that by just segregating and ensuring that where there's harmony, we actually synergize on that. So Dr. Mercy, we have been able to do that under the strategic sector cooperation. And then also through the AgriFI project, we have the food safety steering committees at the county. So this is actually supposed to ensure that what is being consumed locally is safe, so that we don't leave, we don't concentrate so much on the export market, which is really mature and is able to have products that are safe because of the high levels of interventions by the private sector players in that sector. So, but at the domestic market space, then we've actually involved the county teams from trade, from agriculture, from health, together with the competent authorities to ensure that we are actually having a focused agenda in terms of ensuring that what is sold at the wet markets are safe. So, Daktari, I think we've tried as regulators at the national level and the county level so that we have a single approach in terms of food safety in the domestic market.
Mm-hmm. So quite some progress there, and
Thank you.
that the different sectors are coming in together. So we'd like to just take a short commercial break, then we'll come back to the third and final part of this Farm Kenya special, where we are having a conversation on wet market as it pertains to our food safety. You can join us on this conversation on Twitter at KTN News KE, at Dr. Mercy Korir, at Farm Kenya 254, or you can also join us by giving us your comments, your questions on slido.com. The event code is the hashtag Farm Kenya. Please stay with us. We'll come back for the third and last part of this conversation.
This 25th of November, Micro Enterprises Support Program Trust, in partnership with the Ministry of Health, AgriFI, DANIDA, and the European Union, will explore the importance of food safety in our markets, emerging and re-emerging food safety concerns, legal and regulatory framework and infrastructure, and capacity intervention in response to the coronavirus pandemic.
Welcome back to this conversation on Farm Kenya Special, where we are talking about wet markets and food safety. Now, before we went on the break, we were just looking at some of the different actors and some of the different players in this field, really, from the Ministry of Agriculture to the Ministry of Health, the county governments themselves. And on Slido, we have a question here from Wal Njale, and I would pose this to Mr. Henning. With the changing of the approach towards food safety and focusing responsibility on the food business operator, how are the regulating agencies going to synchronize legislation, supervision, inspection, etc. on the operators? I think that's a good question. So how do we synchronize this, Mr. Henning?
Yeah, I think both Charles from DVS and also Josephine from HCD touched upon it before the break, because the overlap in mandates and the many institutions from 3 ministries that regulate the area, of course, make it difficult to coordinate, but the work we have started to synchronize and be clear on the mandate and who takes the responsibility when will help a lot in changing also the approach to the control of food business operators. I think in Europe we had the same situation 20, 30 years ago. In Denmark, we had the regulation and the control at municipalities and with also with different ministries involved. We did not have a single entry to food safety as we have now. Today we have the Danish Veterinary and Food Administration, and I'm sure that a Kenyan food authority would also make it easier to have a one approach to the inspection and control of food business operators. What we do now, because we have the mandates, the laws and the regulation right now, what we do now is to have a joint approach to the inspection system. So first, of course, each institution, each ministry has to agree on the highest level this turnaround in approach to the control system. Kenya, up till now, has very much regulated the food safety area by trying to control the end products, that the food is healthy. when it reaches the consumer. And that's a really, really a difficult or impossible thing to do. You can monitor and you can know what kind of contamination is in the market and you can put measures, but the actual control system has to be with a focus on the food business operators in the whole chain, from the farmer, transporter, the retailer, the small kiosk, and to the restaurant, and so on. I'm very sure that if the different authorities that regulate the area now, through the multi-annual national control plan, can coordinate their efforts and agree on common principles of inspection directed towards the food business operators, it can be done within the existing framework. I think, to my mind, it would be a benefit for Kenya to have a single directorate, but it can still be done within the framework Kenya has right now. I think the next step where we move into is a training of inspectors, because the mandate is at the county level. So the coordination between the counties and the central competent authorities has to be very, very strong. You cannot have a system with 47 different counties with different approaches to the control system. So the coordination here has to be very, very good. And the training of inspectors is also very, very important. We all know that it's not enough to have nice papers and laws that support the control of food business operators. The people in the field that work with the companies, the small business operator every day, they need to know what kind of questions and what kind of answers they should expect to prove that the food business operator know what he or she is doing.
At that point, actually,
so
we have...
there is quite some efforts. Yeah, it is a challenge, but it can be done.
There's actually an anonymous comment here on Slido. Somebody is saying that lack of facilities like washrooms and water sources and lack of dumping areas are some of the biggest issues we have as traders. The problem lies with the county governments, yet we pay for these services. Then James from Nakuru is also, this is a question really, that what is the Ministry of Health doing to ensure Kenyans are sensitized on food safety measures in wet markets? And I think I'd like to throw this question to Brenda, because one of the issues that you have touched on, the panelists here, is about the infrastructure within the wet markets. So what is the ministry doing? And just a comment on that issue about, the lack of sanitary facilities in some of these wet markets, as you give us your closing remarks. Brenda.
Okay, thank you, Mercy, once again. The ministry, actually, most of the requirements that are supposed to be in a wet market are well stipulated even in the Act, that is in the Public Health Act. So the ministry has been working very closely with the county government, and just as Henning has alluded, and also Josephine, that we are already piloting in counties, that's Nakuru County and Nyandarua County, putting up in better infrastructure, of course with the blessing from the county government, so that most of these basic facilities are available in the market. That is the toilets, and also waste management, and not just the waste management being collected and put somewhere, also seeing how it's going to be recycled into either gas, energy, or at least to be useful. So there's so much that is already happening in that space. And once we are able to get it right in these two counties, that is Nakuru and Nyandarua, then this can be rolled out to all the other remaining 45 counties. It's just a matter of time. So there's so much that is already on the ground that is happening in that space. Thank you.
From your own experience, what you're seeing and seeing the pandemic that every country is trying to manage, what would you say the future of wet markets is in Kenya?
Well, if we are to put our structures in place properly, that is making sure that our markets have clean water, clean, safe water. We make sure that the structures are renovated and we allow more spacing. You know, you've seen how the markets, they look like. We are selling our stuff on the floor. We are mixing everything, the dry and the wet products. So if we're able to separate those, if we're able to just put the markets to be run in a more orderly way, then we'll be able to move a step ahead. And of course, I would suggest that, like the community, the committees that are running the markets at the moment, honestly, they should open up the space to allow in the private sector to step in, because it should not be the issue that the Ministry of Health or the government is supposed to be providing all that. It's supposed to be a wholesome kind of approach from all of us who are either traders or the regulators, so that we own the process, all of us together. So once we own the process, then it means we'll all appreciate why our markets have to have clean water, why we need to have space people can move from one end to another without a lot of contact, why we need to have soap in these particular markets, and just to make sure that we are able to be there. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. Coming to Dr. Ochodo, you have really elaborated what the wet markets are, what the legislative framework and the legal frameworks that are needed would look like. Seeing where we are as a globe, do you think we are heading in the right direction, and how long are we on that path to going to the right direction?
Yes, thank you. I think we are heading in the right direction. The only problem is that sometimes we do 2 steps forward and then 1 step backward. And we tend to have different excuses for not meeting the standards that we have put in place. We have talked of the county governments being in charge of these markets. And usually when we get to them and tell them to put in place some of the standards that are there, they'll have their excuses in terms of finance, personnel, and so on. They are not able to. But I think as regulators or inspectors, we just need to put our feet down. Because if we don't do that, and you've already talked about COVID-19, we know that is not going to be the end because we still have a lot more diseases in animals that have the potential to cross over to human beings, particularly through food, these wet markets. And so to protect our people, we just have to ensure that we do the right thing. And so going forward, as people concerned with ensuring that everything in these markets is done right, I think we shall be meeting the county governments, and this has already started through the program. My fellow panelists have referred to the AgriFI program, and discussing with them, because sometimes also things are not happening right because people just do not know what is supposed to happen. And so once they have known what is supposed to happen, then the next thing we shall be doing is closing some of these markets if things are not done right, because we cannot take chances with the health of our people.
Thank you, Dr. Ochodo. Josephine, what is the way forward as you make your final remarks?
Mercy, for me, I see it as an opportunity. because if the wet markets, if the concept takes off, it's actually an investment opportunity to private sector. And we've seen it work when HCD provided facilities for packing, storage, and handling of horticultural produce in a safe manner. And you know, it actually presented an opportunity for people who could not afford these facilities to be able to use and handle their products in a safe manner. So similarly, for the wet markets, I see it as an opportunity for having a cool chain for both storage, handling, and also transportation. So then it is possible to minimize the contamination that arise due to poor handling or suboptimal temperatures that are required to store products, and also the issue of personnel that are not observing hygiene practices. And the facility will only work, Daktari, if we also capacity build the users. Remember, you can only practice or be responsible on food hygiene issues if you are aware on what you need to do. So then the whole actors, transporters, the food business operators, if capacity built and made aware on how to handle products safely, then I think we'll be moving very far. So last but not least, I think I'd also like to highlight the issue of traceability, because that has also been an issue when we have a market that is really not organized. But with the wet market concept, then it would be possible to be able to trace back and forth from the food business operator where they got their supplies of products and where they are selling their products. So then within the competent authorities organized through the strategic sector cooperation, that would be able to start off the concept of withdrawal or recall of products in case of non-compliances. Because Daktari right now, with the foodborne illnesses that Brenda was discussing, it's really very difficult to trace the source of where the non-compliances arise in case of lapses in food safety system. So I'm seeing this more of an opportunity and something that we need to also invest more. And through cooperation and collaboration with the county government and the other competent authorities, then I think we'll be able to achieve the objective that we are seeking in terms of food safety. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Josephine. Last but not least, Mr. Henning, COVID-19 has been definitely a big lesson. What do you see as the future of wet markets in Kenya?
Yes, thank you. A big lesson, and it's definitely not over. But I think I would like to echo very much our good partners in the veterinary authorities, in HCD and health. All the authorities we are working together with here, they are really committed to make changes, and I think that looks into a quite bright future for Kenya, also in the regulation of the wet markets. It's not solutions that we see tomorrow, but I'm very sure we are on the right track. I think it was also mentioned by Dr. Choro that the authorities, the central authorities, has to put down their feet once in a while where you see very, very critical cases. This is a matter of life and death. So I think there's also, this is also an opportunity for us to say to the counties that please don't see the county, the wet market as a source of income only. This is a matter of public health, of course, employment and nice places for farmers and small businesses to sell their products is very, very important. But I think the counties can move away from seeing this as a source of income, also to maybe to lease out the responsibility to a private operator that will be easier to regulate under this framework we are discussing here of food business operators taking the responsibility. We have had these discussions through the new food safety laws with a number of counties, and I know it's super difficult to make changes, but I think that is the way forward. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. I think, yes, all the conversations that have been there, I think it means it's a good start and the right direction to safeguard our wet markets, because as we have seen globally, COVID-19 is a big lesson, definitely, and a wake-up call to make sure that our food markets are safe, that the foods we get from these markets, whether they are animal produce or plant-based produce, that all of them are safe and they are not channels to transmit food-borne diseases. On this conversation, Farm Kenya Special, I was joined by Mr. Henning Nigard, who is the Sector Councillor of Food and Agriculture at the Royal Danish Embassy, joining us from our city center studios. Brenda Obura joining us from Nairobi, who's the lead instructor at the Ministry of Health Food Safety Unit. Dr. Charles Ochodo, who was here with us in studio, who's the Senior Deputy Director of Veterinary Services and the Head of Veterinary Governance and Policy at the Directorate of Veterinary Services. And then last but not least is Josephine Natecho Simiyu, who's the Manager Interim Regulations and Compliance at Agriculture and Food Authority, Horticulture Crops Directorate. I've been your host, Dr. Mercy Korir. Thank you for all of you who have taken time to tweet us, who have taken time to comment on slido.com. We'll continue with these conversations offline, because this food safety is still a going concern for all of us, because as we see, we are still battling the COVID-19 pandemic. Please stay safe, wear your mask, and wash your hands at all times. God bless.
25th of November, Micro Enterprises Support Program Trust, in partnership with the Ministry of Health, AgriFI, DANIDA, and the European Union, will explore the importance of food safety in our markets, emerging and re-emerging food safety concerns, legal and regulatory framework and infrastructure, and capacity intervention in response to the coronavirus pandemic.